Thank you, Professor Mooney. It's an absolute pleasure to have reconnected with you. And as they mentioned, more than 200 articles. One of them I had the privilege of commissioning in the book you mentioned. I want to begin by thanking IDSA. It's a pleasure to be back, and my good friend Ashok, who somehow miraculously has managed to get me here. And has forced me to have a jalebi at lunch, which means I'm going to put myself to sleep as I speak. Conspiracy, yes. So the topic I have today is terrorism and radicalism and the trends. And then also tied to that, the question of identity. But I'm going to take the liberty of being a bad speaker and go off topic. At least in the sense of what we think of terrorism and radicalism in today's conversations. We've heard quite a bit of this already in the past day and a half. But let me just say that I work at an institute in Washington that focuses specifically on peacebuilding and approaches things from a peacebuilding lens, nonviolent conflict resolution lens. And so I want to bring that bias to the table and focus these remarks on this concept, which is the new buzzword in the peacebuilding field, called fragility. Essentially, the big difference between the way I would approach things and the normal conversation that we have usually at the state level is that I think we often end up talking about labels, names of groups who are terrorists, ISIS and this and that. Radicalization and people becoming violent. And the entire conversation is about this ultimate tip of the spectrum where you have manifest violence. How do you stop people from blowing things up? Peace builders often tend to talk about deeper root causes, moving away from symptoms. And this concept of fragility is for some amorphous, but really all-encompassing, talking about the correlation between lack of rule of law, poor governance or predatory governance by states, the presence of ungoverned spaces, and essentially a breach of the theoretically ideal social contract between states and societies. Just simply put, bad governance, as we call it colloquially, but then broken down into many aspects of that as we talk about it. This concept of fragility is crucial because we talked about Afghanistan this morning. We've talked about some other relevant material in the last day and a half. Political settlement, peace deal, all of these conversations about ending violence. Overwhelming majority of peace deals, ceasefires, end to major violence actually go back to violent nature within 5 years. That's data that USIP has sort of looked at around the world. Peace builders tend to differentiate between the concept of positive peace and negative peace. Negative peace is what we talk about every day, absence of violence. We had a war, we had an insurgency, we had a terrorism problem, we've solved it. How? No more violence or very little violence. The concept of positive peace is essentially fragility. It is that just the absence of violence does not mean you are no longer vulnerable to a recurrence of violence. How do you address things that are deeper and keep you susceptible to this problem of recurring violence? And that's really what I want to talk about to you today and sum it up in 4 points, if you allow me, in the next 10 to 12 minutes or so. First of all, I did this book, Professor Mooney mentioned it. There was another book I did about 4 years ago on counterterrorism. And one of my critiques in that book, again, was we seem to be jumping from a group name to another group name. There was Al-Qaeda. And then there was something else. And then suddenly there was ISIS. And now we're declaring victory against ISIS. And tomorrow there will be ABC. What about the phenomena that drives this kind of mega violence? Sometimes called insurgency, sometimes terrorism, but quite frankly, they're now increasingly linked. And in my work, the first conclusion I want to put to you is that one of the deeper issues that haunts countries or regions where there is this kind of violence and deep radicalism is the unfinished nature of the process of nation building in countries. I mean, the best example I will give you, I can give you South Asia's example, but the best example I can give you is the Middle East. You look at all the conversation about the Middle East, Syria, great power competition, Yemen, Saudi, Iran, proxy war, Egypt, Arab Spring, blah, blah. The way I come at it is that post-decolonization, the Middle East got boundaries drawn on maps. It got regimes to protect those boundaries. It could never come up with a sustainable social contract that included the population in the process of decision-making, governance, democracy, and what have you. And ultimately led to deep alienation and disenfranchisement within the population that was controlled till the state, through a heavy-handed security presence, could control it. And as soon as that lid was removed, we saw how things have moved from 2011 onwards. So I actually look at the current process in the Middle East as decolonization 2.0. There is a deeper problem in these societies that cannot be fixed simply by using more military or police force, simply by paying out people, or essentially banishing those who resent and dissent. This unfinished process of nation building, you can define it whichever way you want, but I think is rife in South Asia as well. We have these conversations across the region of identities, multiple identities, some nationalistic, some anti-nationalistic, and some unsure of where they fit. States try very hard to define everything within the scope of sovereignty, and increasingly we see that efforts that are made to quash that come back one way or another. And here, quite frankly, we're talking of some of the strongest militaries and paramilitaries and police forces in the world. The bottom line being that use of force against use of force does not bring sustainable peace. And if I had time, I could talk about Sri Lanka, which is a case study that I've looked at yesterday. You talked about that. It's a great example of a country that's done fantastically to get to negative peace from a major civil war. But the process of moving from that to sustainable peace is a fairly difficult one, as countries, including Sri Lanka, are finding. Let me tie this point to the second one, which I think lies at the heart of much of the data that you pick up. Anytime you find this problem of susceptibility, violence, radicalism, violence, and fragility, the overlap here is a deep sense of alienation and disenfranchisement among pockets of the population. And I want to take this in a different direction. Most people would again say, give them more money, they don't have sort of the political rights and all of that. I actually look at this at a very global level to argue that we have a problem that we are not recognizing, but will very soon have to. The liberal international order that's dictated much of the conversation since the end of the Second World War is in serious trouble. And it's in trouble, it's been amplified because of the Trump phenomena and all of that. But if you look at the rise of populism around the world, what you're seeing is the unpacking of the contradiction within the liberal international order. There was an expectation-reality disconnect because the lofty promises of the liberal international order, which said democracy, economic empowerment, inclusion, rights, ultimately we found that whichever way we come at it, millions and millions have been left out of the benefits of that liberal order. And tie this to another very important development in the last 50 years, which is the communication revolution. For the first time, you have an individual citizen in any country, poor or rich, pretty much a tweet away from communicating with the masses and having a potential to organize like never before. Tahrir Square in Egypt would not have happened without social media. There's simply no way it could have come together. So what you've got is a very interesting combination of an increase in democracy, greater say through the ballot, much more organizational capacity and capacity to dissent, millions left out of the benefits of the liberal order, and states that are still trying to catch up and depending on tools to quash dissent which are 30 years old. We saw presentations this morning, paramilitaries, militaries, police forces, etc. There's a mismatch here. And what we are looking at, quite frankly, is that this alienation and disenfranchisement. People rightly point out that the liberal order has reduced poverty to record levels. It has actually brought battlefield deaths down. They are lower than any time in history, recorded history. And yet there is a difference. Because of the communication revolution, it is no longer as important to look at absolute deprivation and alienation. What has happened is that people can now very quickly compare themselves to the rest of the world, other countries, other regions. It's relative deprivation that drives people to be susceptible to violence. It drives fault lines to become more pronounced. And this is a data point I want to give you through because of my research. Anytime terrorist organizations, people who are driving people towards susceptibility to violence, can identify the most potent fault lines in societies and exploit that, you are much likely to end up with violence. In some countries it's religious, in others it's ethnic, in others it's communal. But as soon as you can identify the most potent fault lines in societies and exploit that, the chances are that with the communication revolution, with millions disenfranchised, you can find space, not necessarily to make everybody a terrorist, but to create sympathy for anti-state actions that may be outside the realm of civil disobedience. If I bring all of this together, there's one word that I would put to you. And South Asia is rife with this. You can apply from whichever country you are, apply to your country, and you'll find that the answer will be yes. There is growing intolerance for diversity of opinion across the region. Could be more religious in some places, could be ethnic in others, could be political in others. But what we are finding is societies becoming polarized. The middle is finding it very hard to keep the conversation going. And this in itself is one of the reasons for the rise of populism and populist governments around the world, including this region, where you've got this echo chamber effect in social media, you've got polarization and greater intolerance for diversity. So now if there are organizations or actors who can exploit that intolerance, identify the fault lines and exploit it, you are much more likely to end up with more susceptibility to violence in societies. How much violence you ultimately have can be a function of many things. And the final point I want to make to you is that resources are absolutely crucial. And I'm not talking of only money. I'm not talking of guns. What I'm talking about is mobilization of resources writ large. There are three ways they happen. Number one, they can happen because of states. States can mobilize violent actors because of geopolitics, because of interstate competition, because of political reasons. They can actually exploit the fault lines for their own short-term political gains, and almost 100% the track record is, in the long run, it will come back to haunt the society because violence will get out of control. Second, resource mobilization can happen despite states. States can be excessively weak. They may not have writ over their territory. And so when ungoverned spaces open up, the possibility of violence goes up in societies where there's already a lot of susceptibility to violence and the fault lines that I've talked about. Afghanistan is a very good example of that right now. right? But then there are pockets in all South Asian countries where this is happening. And the third is external actors. I could spend the whole day talking about this here, on how external actors play roles. But the book I did that Professor Mooney mentioned, one of my key conclusions there was that external actors creating instability, just 2 more minutes, instability is the norm, not the exception in South Asia. Virtually every major conflict, you'd find fingerprints of outsiders. Now the problem here is that states will disproportionately focus on only that and say, my problem is this other guy is doing something to me, forgetting this entire fragility problem that I've just explained to you. The intolerance for diversity and all of that is happening within societies. And we need to rebalance that somehow. Finally, let me just say one thing about state response. I said it's 30 years behind. Overwhelming majority of the times, the states in South Asia and elsewhere have done two things. One, throw money at the problem. You have unrest somewhere, people are not happy, transfer money. You look at all turbulent regions in South Asia, they would have one of the highest direct transfers from the central government to that authority, province, state, whatever it is. It never works. Why? Because the problem is political alienation and disenfranchisement. Almost never are the actual fault lines economic. They're built on something else. And finally, state heavy-handedness. There is now new data that shows that people in state security custody who are tortured and treated illegally are more likely to become violent against the state once they are let go. Let me end by saying something that Ashok started with in his opening remarks yesterday. Fragility does not respect borders. I get very worried when I go to South Asian countries and hear their problem. Yeah, they'll deal with it. Shouldn't come here. Or make their problem worse. If fragility spreads the way it's spreading in this region, every South Asian country will be affected by it. Let me stop.